The war had stopped issuing medical supplies in the way the manuals promised. By the third year, field hospitals were improvising with whatever remained: wood scraps, cloth strips, morphine from captured German kits, and prayers. In a forward aid station, 10 kilometers behind the Eastern Front, a former schoolteacher turned combat medic named Jacob Rice began experimenting with cardboard salvaged from ammunition crates. He soaked it, shaped it, let it harden into rigid shells that held fractured limbs steady. The senior surgeon dismissed it as waste. The orderlies joked. But when the offensive came, when casualties arrived faster than the hospital could receive them, Jacob's cardboard splints would become the difference between a soldier who walked again and one who didn't. What no one anticipated was the cost of being right when authority demanded failure, and the impossible choice between following orders and keeping men alive. This is a story about how survival sometimes requires us to believe in what others ridicule, and how that belief can demand everything. Chapter 1. The Mockery. The cardboard came from a crate of rifle ammunition, stamped with Cyrillic letters no one bothered to translate. Jacob Rice pulled it apart in the corner of the aid station, behind the surgical table where Dr. Volkov worked with the precision of a man who had stopped believing anything he did mattered. "You're wasting medical time," Volkov said without looking up. He was threading suture through a soldier's abdomen, his gloved hands moving like a pianist whose music had turned to blood. "I'm preparing for what comes next," Jacob replied. He had learned not to defend himself. Defense required energy, and in the Eastern Front, energy was rationed like morphine. The orderlies, Mikhail and Petya, both teenagers who had forgotten what sleep felt like, stopped carrying supplies to watch. Mikhail laughed first. It was not cruel laughter. It was the laughter of exhaustion, of men watching someone attempt the impossible with wood pulp and water. "Cardboard," Mikhail said, "to keep bones straight. Gypsum casts need time we don't have," Jacob explained quietly. He was soaking strips in a solution of boiled animal fat and flour, watching the cardboard soften, then harden into a shape that held firm. "If I can splint a fracture in minutes instead of hours, more men return to the line with functional arms and legs." "More men return to die differently," Petya said. It was not meant as cruelty. It was simple mathematics. Volkov finished the last suture and turned to watch. The surgeon was older than Jacob, Soviet army from before the revolution, a man who had seen empires collapse and been reassembled into something that obeyed. He looked at the cardboard shells with the expression of someone examining a child's drawing. Distant, unmoved, but not entirely dismissive. "If it fails," Volkov said, "it fails in the record. If it succeeds in the record. Either way, command will have something to investigate." That was the only approval Jacob would receive. The first test came that night. A sapper's team returned with a soldier whose right forearm had snapped across the radius. Jacob could see the angle was wrong, the swelling already darkening. He worked quickly, immobilizing the break with the cardboard shell, securing it with strips of fabric. The soldier, a Belarusian named Dmitri, watched with the slack attention of morphine. "Will it hold?" Dmitri asked. "Yes," Jacob said. He did not know if this was true, but in war, men needed certainty more than they needed truth. By dawn, Dmitri's swelling had diminished. The alignment remained true. Jacob checked it 3 times, running his fingers along the immobilized forearm, feeling for any shift in the cardboard's grip. Nothing moved. The bone remained where Jacob had placed it. Mikhail noticed first. He said nothing, but his expression changed. A small widening of the eyes, the beginning of belief. Chapter 2. The pattern word traveled through the aid station, the way rumors always did in war, fragmented, distorted, then hardened into something approaching fact. By the second week, Jacob had constructed 43 cardboard splints. Most held, 2 failed, one because a soldier had fallen, another because infection had forced amputation anyway. The failures meant nothing, the pattern meant everything. Volkov began requesting them. Petya began preparing them without being asked. Even the senior surgeon's dismissal softened into something closer to indifference, which in a military hospital was acceptance. Then Captain Lebedev arrived from Divisional Command to inspect the station. He was younger than Volkov, which made him dangerous. He still believed in precision, in systems, in the idea that war could be managed like a ledger. He observed Jakob working, watched the cardboard soften and harden, watched Dmitri, who had returned from light duty, flex his wrist. "This is not regulation," Lebedev said. It was not a question. "No, sir," Jacob replied, "but it works." "That is irrelevant." Lebedev's voice carried the weight of men who had read regulations so many times they had confused them with justice. Medical supplies are documented. Improvisation without authorization is saving lives, Volkov interrupted quietly. The surgeon had not looked up from preparing instruments. "Captain, we are 14 kilometers from the nearest surgical theater. Evacuation by truck takes 8 hours if the roads hold. These splints keep fractures stable for transport. The alternative is gangrene, amputation, or death." Lebedev consulted his clipboard. "I will file a report with Moscow." That night, Jakob did not sleep. He understood what the report meant. Investigation, scrutiny, the machinery of bureaucracy turning its attention toward him. In the Soviet army, attention was a prelude to punishment. It was also possible the report would be lost, filed in the chaos of war, forgotten among thousands of other complaints about resources, about survival, about men doing what needed to be done. Mikhail found him in the dark, checking the splints one more time. "He'll forget," Mikhail said, "or he'll die before the paperwork reaches Moscow. Both are equally likely." Jacob hoped the boy was right. Chapter 3. The Offensive. The artillery began on a Tuesday morning, though by that point no one marked days anymore. There was only before the shelling and after. The casualties arrived in waves. First came the lightly wounded, shrapnel grazes, concussions, men still capable of walking. Then came the rest. Soldiers carried on stretchers, limbs at angles, that meant amputation or mercy. The surgery filled with blood and screaming, and Volkov worked without pausing, his hands moving faster than Jakob had ever seen, as if speed might outrun death. Jakob worked in the triage room, assessing fractures, setting bones, wrapping cardboard shells around breaks that would have taken an hour to stabilize with gypsum. He worked without speaking, without hesitation, his hands moving through the motions he had practiced 100 times on 50 men. A femur fracture, a shattered clavicle, a compound fracture of the tibia that meant amputation was coming. But first, the bone had to be stable for transport. Mikhail was crying as he handed Jakob supplies. Petya had stopped responding to orders, staring at a wall with the empty expression of someone whose mind had fled. By nightfall, 42 more men had come through. 34 had received cardboard splints. None had come undone. Lebedev appeared at midnight, his uniform torn, his face streaked with blood that was not his. He watched Jakob work without speaking. When Jakob finished the last splint, a young officer from Moscow with a broken wrist, Lebedev finally spoke. "How many?" he asked. 34 today, Jakob said. 91 total. Lebedev looked at the officer's immobilized wrist, at the cardboard shell holding the bone perfectly still. "The report," he said quietly, "was lost in the chaos. I assume you understand this means nothing is documented." Jakob understood. Volkov, emerging from surgery with blood under his fingernails, also understood. If this story feels real to you, tell us in the comments. What would you have done in their place? Chapter 4. the weight of success. The offensive continued for 5 more days. The casualties stopped coming on the 6th, not because the fighting ended, but because there was no one left to send. The front had collapsed or advanced or been replaced by another front. In a war of movement and chaos, distinction became meaningless. Jakob was awake for 43 hours straight. When he finally stopped moving, his body shut down in the middle of changing a dressing. Mikhail caught him before he fell, carried him to the corner where the medical staff slept in shifts on blankets over straw. He dreamed of cardboard. In the dreams, it did not harden. It remained soft, malleable, unable to hold anything. He watched bones shift inside the paper shells and could not stop them. He woke to Volkov shaking his shoulder. The surgeon's eyes were different now, exhausted. Yes, but also something else, something that looked like respect or its ghost. "There is a problem," Volkov said. In the surgical theater, Volkov showed him the soldier, the same officer from the offensive, the one with the wrist. The man was running fever. His wrist was swollen, the skin around the cardboard splint darkening from inflammation to infection. "The cardboard held," Volkov said. "Too well." The swelling occurred beneath the shell. No drainage. Bacteria thrived in the moisture. Jakob felt the officer's wrist carefully. Inside the rigid cardboard, he could sense the warmth of infection, the gathering of pus. The splint was not holding a bone anymore. It was trapping poison. "Remove it," Jakob said. The surgery took an hour. Volkov drained the abscess, cleaned the wound, assessed the bone. The wrist was saved, but the infection had cost the officer 3 weeks of recovery and the use of 2 fingers. It was better than amputation, but only barely. "Your splints are not the answer," Lebedev said. He had returned to inspect the station. "They are, as I suspected, insufficient." "They work for the first 72 hours, Jakob replied carefully. "After that, they must be monitored, opened, if swelling occurs. Then they are not the solution, they are a delay, and delay creates hope, which creates suffering when the hope ends." Lebedev left that afternoon. His next report, if he filed one, would have teeth. Chapter 5. The Interrogation. The NKVD investigator arrived on a Sunday, though no one could have known it was Sunday. He was a thin man, with eyes that seemed to contain arithmetic, weighing, calculating, determining which answers were worth recording. His name was Petrov, and he had come to discuss the cardboard splints with someone in authority. Volkov directed him to Jakob. "You developed this improvisation?" Petrov asked. "I attempted to solve a logistical problem," Jakob replied. Gypsum casts were unavailable, evacuation time was extended, fractures require immobilization. I used available materials. "You use materials without authorization?" "Yes. You could have reported the shortage and waited for resupply." Jakob said nothing. They both knew what resupply meant, 6 months of waiting if it came at all. Petrov consulted a notebook. 43 soldiers received your splints in the preliminary period. 34 received them during the offensive. Of those, 77, 61 returned to active duty. 6 required amputation, 2 died of infection, 8 remain unaccounted for. The numbers were precise. Someone had been counting. "All of those men would have been worse off with standard care," Jakob said carefully. "Most would not have returned to duty at all." "That is a statement of opinion, not fact." "With respect, sir, their return to the line is fact. The cardboard kept their bones aligned during evacuation. Many would have suffered permanent damage from improperly set fractures. I can show you the soldiers who—" "That will not be necessary," Petrov interrupted. "Your innovation is being reviewed by Moscow. Until that review is complete, all further use of this method is suspended. All soldiers currently treated with cardboard splints will be transferred to standard care within the week." You will cooperate fully with this transition. The word came down the next morning. Jacob's splints were forbidden. Chapter 6. The Choice. The order arrived as the next wave of casualties began. A reconnaissance patrol had walked into a minefield, 15 soldiers, 8 of them with fractured limbs. Volkov read the order twice, then looked at Jakob. "We use gypsum," the surgeon said quietly. "Regulation." One of the soldiers, a sergeant named Orlov, had a compound fracture of both radius and ulna. Under regulation care, the fracture would take 6 hours to set properly. Surgical intervention, careful alignment, time. Evacuation would not be possible for 8 hours minimum. In that window, swelling would occur. The bone might shift. Orlov might lose function in his arm entirely. With Jacob's method, 40 minutes to stabilization. Evacuation possible within 2 hours. "The order is clear," Lebedev said. He had stayed at the station. "Regulation." Volkov looked at Jakob. The surgeon's hands were trembling slightly, not from fatigue, but from the weight of the choice before him. "We have enough gypsum for 5 patients," Mikhail said quietly from across the room. "We have enough cardboard for 12. Lebedev's expression hardened. He understood what was being suggested. Jakob looked at Orlov. At the sergeant's arm, bent at an angle that meant months of recovery, or permanent disability if the bone was not held perfectly. He thought of Dmitri, whose wrist had healed cleanly. He thought of the officer, whose infection had been managed when the cardboard was opened and monitored. "We use gypsum for the most critical cases," Volkov said to Lebedev. "The others I will improvise as needed." It was not a direct refusal. It was a doctor exercising judgment, which was still permitted, barely, in Soviet military medicine. Lebedev did not respond. He simply turned and left the station. Jakob used cardboard for 7 of the 8 soldiers. All 7 were stabilized within 90 minutes. All 7 were evacuated by midday. The 8th, a young private with a simple fracture, received gypsum and regulation care. If this battle still echoes in your mind, hit like. It helps these untold memories stay alive. Chapter 7. The Silence. The war ended 3 weeks later, though ended was a generous term. The front simply collapsed into the chaos of victory, of occupation, of bureaucracy replacing artillery. Jakob remained at the aid station for another month, treating the walking wounded, the infected, the men who had survived the fighting but were slowly dying of complications. No one asked him about the cardboard. No one filed charges. The order remained in effect, regulation only, but in the collapse of command structure, the order became meaningless. What mattered was what worked. What worked was cardboard. 6 months after the war ended, Jakob was discharged from the Soviet army with a commendation for medical innovation. The commendation did not mention the cardboard. It mentioned exceptional resourcefulness in challenging conditions. Lebedev had signed it. Jakob returned to teaching. He had been a mathematics instructor before the war, but he spent his evenings corresponding with surgeons across the Eastern Bloc, describing the technique, the timing, the critical importance of monitoring for swelling and infection. Volkov had written to the Academy of Medicine in Moscow. The response had been bureaucratic silence, which in the Soviet Union meant eventual acceptance. By 1950, modified versions of Jakob's cardboard splint had been adopted in 3 countries. By 1960, they had become standard in field hospitals across Eastern Europe. No one remembered that it had begun as a waste of ammunition crate cardboard, born from a school teacher's refusal to accept the mathematics of acceptable casualties. Jakob died in 1987, a week before the wall fell. At his funeral, Dmitri, now a grandfather with a fully functional wrist, sat in the front row. So did the officer from Moscow, who had lost the use of 2 fingers but kept the arm. Neither man spoke about the cardboard. The silence was its own language, the language of survival when authority had demanded loss. What remains is not memory, but evidence. The splints themselves, preserved in military museums, still holding their shape after 70 years. Cardboard does not rot the way flesh does. It simply hardens further, bearing witness to what was decided when a man chose to believe in something that made no sense and was proven right. Subscribe for more true human stories of courage, conscience, and the wars that never really end.